Donald Trump has applied sustained pressure on Canada, expecting a familiar pattern to unfold. The assumption in Washington was that aggressive trade tactics and constant public threats would fracture the political environment in Ottawa, forcing the government to negotiate from a position of vulnerability. But that sequence did not hold. Instead of fracturing, the pressure has triggered an unexpected and structural shift in Canadian politics. Prime Minister Mark Carney is not just surviving this pressure, he is utilizing it to consolidate power. And the Canadian public is not resisting this shift. They are actively demanding it. What we are seeing is a realignment where domestic political loyalty is being completely overridden by the need for external security. The conventional rules of opposition politics are being suspended. Listen to how analysts are now describing the clear, overriding mandate that voters have handed to Ottawa in the face of this external pressure.
For the Conservatives, they have to be careful. If they just announce all of this as, parliamentary games and devilish backroom deals, at some point they also take themselves off script. Because, frankly, Canadians don't care about raw politics. What they care about is whether or not someone is standing up to Trump, trying to improve our standard of living, doing something about what's going on in the Middle East, which is pounding us at the gas pumps, obviously. And, those are the issues that the Prime Minister is trying to concentrate on. The Conservatives have to beat him on that battlefield, or they're not going to be able to reclaim floor crossers or win by-elections.
That is not a standard political observation. That is a signal of a massive behavioral shift. The opposition is complaining about parliamentary tactics and the loss of their members, but that argument assumes Canadians still care about raw domestic politics. They do not. When a country feels a direct economic threat from Washington, internal squabbling becomes a liability. Donald Trump's negotiating style relies heavily on creating urgency and division. He applies pressure to force mistakes. But, in this case, that strategy has completely backfired. By constantly targeting Canada, Trump has inadvertently provided Mark Carney with the ultimate political capital. Carney offers stability in a volatile environment, and the public is rewarding him with unprecedented authority. This is a deliberate consolidation. The electorate is effectively telling its leaders that partisan games are no longer acceptable. They want a unified front to manage the unpredictable posture of the United States. Listen to how experts are characterizing the sheer historical weight and the root cause of this sudden political alignment.
So, if the Liberals get that majority tonight, what happens tomorrow and moving forward for now the majority government?
So, a couple of ways of answering that question. Tomorrow, we'll likely hear from the Prime Minister, and it's worth noting, even though we've now talked and discussed this for a number of days, this will be an historic outcome. To have a government be able to accumulate a majority in the House of Commons by way of by-election and floor crossers, this isn't something you see every day. This is not a situation with precedent. So the first thing is we'll likely hear from the government. My suspicion is it will want to be modest in its tone. It will not want to be celebratory or triumphal, because what's bringing all of this on is a sense of crisis and external anxiety about Donald Trump trade, cost of living, price of gases, price of groceries, all of that rolled up into one, and a demand for stability and leadership.
An historic outcome. This is not a temporary bump in the polls. It is a fundamental recalibration of power. Mark Carney is achieving a majority, not through a general election, but by systematically absorbing his opposition. And he is doing it because the Canadian people demand a unified posture. This is code for total political consolidation. The anxiety surrounding Donald Trump has acted as a gravitational pull, drawing politicians across the spectrum into a single command structure. By bringing rivals into the fold, the government eliminates internal vulnerabilities and presents an unbroken front to American negotiators. Trump's unpredictability creates a void, and Carney's actions close it perfectly. But here is where this dynamic becomes a lethal trap for the domestic opposition. If the only metric of political viability in Canada today is the ability to stand up to Washington anyone not aligned with that objective becomes irrelevant. The Conservative leadership is stuck in a paradigm that no longer exists. They are attempting to argue about domestic grievances, but the voters have already moved on. The Canadian public has zero patience for leaders who are not actively managing the external threat. This creates an inescapable problem for Pierre Poilievre. His political brand was built to fight a domestic government over internal economic policy. But the structural reality has changed. The primary threat is no longer internal. By failing to pivot and failing to present a credible alternative to manage Donald Trump, Poilievre has isolated his own leadership. His own members of parliament recognize this vulnerability, which is why they are actively shifting their alignment. Watch how the analysts deliver a stark reality check on the failure of the opposition's current strategy.
All I know is this: if you're Pierre Poilievre and you've lost 5 members of parliament, even 4 members of parliament, I should say, and if you lose 3 by-elections, and if you lost your seat in the last election and you lost the general election, at some point you got to look in the mirror and say, what do I need to do different? There hasn't been a good sign in a long time for him. He needs to change the way it's working.
Look in the mirror. That is a definitive political verdict. The Conservative opposition is not simply losing to Mark Carney's legislative tactics. They are losing because the Canadian electorate has drawn a very clear line. Canadians have demonstrated that they will abandon any leader who cannot project stability and strength against sustained American pressure. Trump attempted to isolate his northern neighbor, expecting a quick capitulation. Instead, he forced Canada to close its ranks and build a unified political front. What makes this development so critical is how it alters the balance of leverage. By refusing to engage in divided politics, Canada has effectively neutralized the primary pressure tactics that the White House has relied on. This is the exact opposite of what the American administration intended. Every aggressive tariff threat and every attempt to bypass Ottawa's authority has backfired, because in a high-stakes trade negotiation, political unity is the ultimate leverage. Carney saw this structural opening, and he capitalized on it. He transformed external anxiety into internal consolidation. The politicians crossing the floor are not doing so out of convenience. They are making a calculated decision based on political viability. They understand that the Canadian electorate has shifted its baseline expectations. You either stand with the unified national front, or you are removed from the equation. This is why the political erosion for Pierre Poilievre is accelerating. His domestic arguments have been completely overshadowed by a singular, overarching demand for national sovereignty. This also represents a severe miscalculation by the United States. By assuming Canada would capitulate under economic strain, Washington underestimated the resilience of the Canadian political system. The voters are signaling that economic friction is a necessary price to pay if it means protecting their structural independence from foreign interference. And that distinction matters because it redefines the rules of engagement moving forward. Canada is no longer negotiating from a posture of dependency or internal division. It is negotiating as a fully mobilized state, backed by an electorate that has given its leadership an unprecedented mandate to hold the line. The data and the political shifts tell a clear story. They show a system moving away from fragmentation and advancing toward total alignment. Trump wanted a fractured neighbor to exploit for a quick victory. He received a unified economic bloc that refuses to concede. If this trajectory holds, Canada will no longer react to Washington's volatility, but will forge an independent and resilient path forward. The dynamic of North American politics has been permanently altered, not by yielding to pressure, but by absorbing it and responding with absolute political unity. Subscribe to Canada SR for sharp, in-depth analysis on the global power shifts that are quietly reshaping Canada's future. Because moments like this aren't just headlines, they're turning points.